Representatives of all the royal houses of Europe. Queen Frederica acted as sponsor to her 24-year-old son.
By the time the cameras found them in Exile, the fairy tale had already changed shape. Only a few years earlier, Princess Anne-Marie of Denmark had arrived in Athens as a very young royal bride, stepping into what looked like one of Europe's most glittering futures. She married King Constantine II in September 1964 and became Queen of the Hellenes, part of a dynasty that still seemed to belong to a stable and ceremonial world. But Greece was already moving toward rupture. After the military coup of April 1967, and after Constantine's failed countermove in December of that same year, he and Anne-Marie fled the country with their family. The image that remained was no longer a wedding portrait. It was something colder, more fragile, and far more revealing. A royal marriage suddenly trapped inside a collapsing state. That is what makes this story feel larger than romance and sadder than scandal. How does a Danish princess step into a crown only to find herself living the life of an exile almost before the marriage has settled? What happens to love when it is forced to carry not just ceremony and expectation, but political shock, public fear, and the weight of a nation losing its balance? And when history crashes through the walls of a royal household, where does the private story end and the public one begin? To understand why Anne-Marie and Constantine still feel so haunting as a couple, we have to go back to the version of them the world first fell in love with. To the public, Anne-Marie and Constantine looked almost impossibly well cast. He was young, athletic, and already internationally known, not only as the new king of the Hellenes but also as an Olympic gold medalist whose image carried glamour as easily as duty. She was the youngest daughter of the Danish royal family, blonde, poised, and still on the threshold between girlhood and queenship. Their engagement, announced in January 1963, had the sheen of an old European romance, linking dynasties, ceremonies, and a world that still believed royalty could embody continuity. By the time they married in Athens on the 18th of September, 1964, 2 weeks after Anne-Marie's 18th birthday, the wedding itself had become a major royal spectacle, drawing foreign royals, diplomats, and a courtly audience, large enough to make the occasion feel less like a private union than a statement about monarchy itself. That was the version people saw first: the beautiful young queen, the handsome young king, and a marriage that seemed to promise renewal. For Denmark, Anne-Marie's departure carried a note of grandeur, the youngest princess stepping into a throne abroad. For Greece, the image was equally potent. Constantine had only just succeeded his father in 1964, and the arrival of a young queen gave the monarchy a fresh, almost cinematic softness at exactly the moment it needed one. The symbolism mattered. This was not simply a wedding between two aristocratic houses. It was presented, visually and emotionally, as a future. A new reign, a modern royal couple for a changing Europe. But even in those early years, there were signs that the image was carrying more weight than it could safely hold. Constantine's reign began under intense political strain, and what looked from the outside like the start of a long royal story was in reality unfolding inside one of the most unstable periods in modern Greek history. That is what makes this couple so compelling in retrospect. The first fracture was not a whispered affair or a bitter public feud. It was something quieter and, in many ways, more dangerous. The sense that the marriage was being asked to project calm, while the state around it was losing control. Before the exile, before the collapse, before the myth hardened into memory, the warning signs were already there. They were simply easier to miss when the photographs were still so beautiful. The real pressure in this story did not begin with gossip, betrayal, or any private revelation. It began with the roles themselves. Anne-Marie was not simply a young woman entering marriage. She was a Danish princess, born in 1946, who by the autumn of 1964 had crossed almost overnight from royal daughter to queen consort of another country. The Danish royal house records that she married Constantine in September 1964, and the public image around her was one of elegance, youth, and continuity. But youth can look deceptively strong in photographs. In reality, she was stepping into one of the most demanding positions in Europe at an age when most people are still discovering who they are, not learning how to stand inside a monarchy under pressure. And Constantine himself was under a weight that rarely gets conveyed by the polished imagery of that era. Britannica notes that he succeeded to the throne in March 1964 after the death of King Paul. He was young, admired, and outwardly modern, but he was also inheriting a crown in a country where the monarchy was not merely ceremonial decoration. It was entangled in power, legitimacy, and the question of who truly governed Greece. That meant Anne-Marie was not marrying into stability. She was marrying into a throne that still had to fight for its authority and into a public role that demanded serenity at exactly the moment when serenity was least available. Even before the final rupture, the institution around them was already brittle. That is why this relationship works so well as a documentary story. The central tension is not just romantic, it is structural. A very young couple were asked to embody calm, glamour, and national continuity, while the political ground beneath them was shifting. Britannica notes that Constantine's clash with Prime Minister Georgios Papandreou in July 1965 deepened the crisis, and that the military coup of April 1967 came before the elections that had been planned for May. Those facts matter because they change how we read the marriage itself. What the public saw as a royal partnership was also a partnership living inside permanent compression. Ceremony on the outside, instability underneath. In that kind of atmosphere, even affection can start to feel secondary to survival, and image can become less a reflection of reality than a shield against it. So when people later looked back on Anne-Marie and Constantine as a tragic royal couple, they were not only reacting to exile, they were reacting to the cruel mismatch at the heart of the story. Two beautiful, young royals presented as the future, even as history was already closing in on them. Before the marriage became a symbol of loss, it had first become a performance of steadiness under impossible conditions. And that performance could not hold forever. At the beginning, the relationship seemed to offer exactly the kind of story royalty depends on. Anne-Marie and Constantine were young, elegant, and easy to believe in. The Danish royal house records that they married in Athens on the 18th of September, 1964, the same year Constantine had taken the throne after the death of King Paul. In public terms, that timing mattered. Greece did not simply gain a new king, it gained a new royal couple. And with them came the visual promise of renewal, youth after mourning, beauty after uncertainty, continuity after transition. Their marriage looked less like the start of a private life than the unveiling of a national symbol. That was also the first hidden pressure point. What gave the couple their appeal was the very thing that made them vulnerable. They were not an established royal pair, easing into familiar roles. They were a very young husband and wife being asked to reassure a country already moving into political danger. Constantine had inherited not only a crown but a crisis. Britannica notes that in July 1965, he dismissed Prime Minister Georgios Papandreou, a decision that deepened instability and dragged the monarchy more directly into the center of political conflict. In another kind of marriage, early years might have been spent building habits, privacy, and trust. In theirs, those early years were being consumed by constitutional confrontation, public scrutiny, and the impossible demand that they continue to look calm while the institution around them was beginning to shake. So the fracture did not begin as a romantic scandal, it began as a change in atmosphere. The photographs still showed the same faces, but the meaning behind them was shifting. A royal appearance that once suggested optimism now had to suggest control. A public smile had to do more than charm, it had to reassure. Anne-Marie's role, especially, became more revealing in retrospect. She had entered Greece as the young foreign bride who softened the image of a new reign. But, as the crisis worsened, she stood beside a king whose position was becoming more contested by the month. The marriage was still visible, still ceremonial, still recognizable as a royal partnership, but the emotional temperature around it had changed. What had looked like the beginning of a glamorous future was slowly becoming a performance of steadiness under mounting strain. That is often how royal stories begin to break. Not with one loud collapse, but with a gradual mismatch between the image being projected and the reality pressing in behind it. Then came the point when pressure stopped being background and became fate. On the 21st of April, 1967, a group of army officers seized power in Greece. Reuters and Britannica both note that Constantine briefly cooperated with the junta before attempting a counter-coup in December of that year. It failed almost immediately, Britannica states that he then fled to Rome with his family, while Reuters describes the exile that followed with Anne-Marie and their children. In narrative terms, this is where the small fracture spread through the entire structure. The couple who had once stood for a new reign were now defined by removal, uncertainty, and displacement. The public image did not merely weaken, it changed category altogether. They were no longer the bright young sovereigns of a future-oriented monarchy. They had become a royal family in flight. And that is the cruel center of the story. Anne-Marie and Constantine did not have the chance to let their marriage grow slowly inside a stable world. History accelerated around them and forced the relationship into a harsher shape. Every warning sign that had been easy to overlook in the early glamour now looked obvious in hindsight. The political volatility, the fragility of the throne, the fact that their public role demanded a confidence that events could no longer support. What broke first was not necessarily the bond between them. It was the idea that love, ceremony, and royal grace could hold back a national collapse. Once that illusion gave way, everything else would be seen differently too. The moment everything turned in this story did not arrive as a confession, a leaked letter, or a humiliating headline. It arrived as a constitutional rupture. On the 21st of April, 1967, a group of army officers seized power in Greece before the elections that had been expected in May. For Anne-Marie and Constantine, that changed the meaning of everything at once. Until then, they had still been able to stand inside the illusion that beauty, youth, and royal ceremony might steady a fragile reign. After the coup, that illusion became much harder to maintain. The crisis was no longer surrounding the monarchy. It was now testing whether the monarchy could survive at all. What made the public pay attention was not only the coup itself, but Constantine's position inside it. Reuters notes that he became deeply unpopular for swearing in the military junta that seized power, even though he later tried to resist it. That detail matters because it shattered the cleaner version of the royal image. Until that point, Anne-Marie and Constantine could still be seen as a young couple caught in a national storm. Once he swore in the colonels, the picture darkened. To supporters, it could be read as an act of necessity, a young king trying to preserve room to maneuver inside a dangerous situation. To critics, it looked like weakness at best and complicity at worst. Either way, the old image of the poised royal pair no longer held its original innocence. And this is where the story becomes especially powerful for documentary storytelling, because the turning point was not clean, it was morally blurred. Constantine was not yet the king in exile. Anne-Marie was not yet the queen without a country. For a brief period, they existed in that far more uncomfortable space between image and collapse, where every public gesture could be interpreted in opposite ways. The monarchy still stood, but its authority had thinned. Their marriage still existed in public, but now it was being watched through the harsher lens of political failure. The fairy tale had not yet ended, but it had lost control of its own meaning. What the audience sees here is not just a government crisis. It is the exact moment when a royal love story becomes inseparable from national distrust. Then came the move that turned uncertainty into irreversible damage. Britannica states that Constantine attempted a counter-coup from northern Greece on the 13th of December, 1967, but had few sympathizers and almost immediately fled to Rome with his family. In narrative terms, this is the point of no return. The failed countermove is what transformed him from a sovereign under pressure into a displaced monarch whose power had become almost entirely symbolic. And for Anne-Marie, it altered the emotional core of the story. She was no longer simply the young Danish princess who had married into a troubled crown. She was now the wife of a king who had gambled on restoring authority and lost. The flight itself carries an emotional charge that no royal ceremony could conceal. Reuters describes Constantine being forced into exile in late 1967 with Anne-Marie and their young family. That is the image that changed public perception for good. Exile has a way of stripping glamour down to its rawest truth. Once a royal couple leaves under pressure, once the palace becomes something remembered rather than inhabited, the entire public narrative changes shape. The wedding photographs are still there. The uniforms, the tiaras, the dazzling state ritual all remain in the archive. But they no longer look like the beginning of a reign. They begin to look like evidence of how quickly a reign can lose its footing. What made this turning point so powerful was that it destroyed not just position but coherence. A monarchy depends on continuity, on the feeling that the institution is larger than any one crisis. But Reuters and Britannica both make clear that after the coup, the swearing in of the junta, the failed counter-coup, and the exile, Constantine's standing was profoundly damaged. The monarchy was no longer projecting inevitability. It was projecting fragility. And once that happens, the public begins to reinterpret everything that came before. Anne-Marie and Constantine had once symbolized renewal. Now they symbolized interruption, uncertainty, and the spectacle of royal dignity losing its grip on events. The deeper tragedy is that the turning point was not only public, it was existential. A young couple had been asked to embody the future. Then, in barely 3 years, history forced them into a completely different role. Not the smiling face of a modern monarchy, but the displaced family of a fallen one. Reuters notes that the junta abolished the monarchy in 1973, and that in a referendum after the junta's fall in 1974, Greeks rejected monarchy again. Those later events matter because they show that the damage of 1967 was not temporary. The turning point was real. Once the country moved past the crown, the old image could never truly be rebuilt. That is why this chapter lands with such force. The public did not witness a marriage breaking in the conventional way. It witnessed something colder and, in some ways, more devastating. A royal couple losing the world that had given their marriage its shape. The crown did not collapse in one theatrical second. It weakened, compromised itself, tried to recover, and then failed in plain sight. By the time Anne-Marie and Constantine were living in exile, the question was no longer whether their image had changed. It had. The real question was what that change would cost them for the rest of their lives. And that is where the story moves next. Into the damage, the narrative, and the long afterlife of a royal fall. What happened next was not the kind of damage that can be measured only in headlines. It was institutional, personal, and strangely permanent. After the failed counter-coup and the family's exile, Constantine remained king in name for a time, but the authority behind that title had been hollowed out. Britannica notes that the junta formally abolished the monarchy in June 1973, and that after the fall of the dictatorship, a new referendum in December 1974 rejected its return. Constantine accepted the result. In simple constitutional terms, that ended the reign. But emotionally, it did something more profound. It turned Anne-Marie and Constantine from a ruling couple into the surviving image of a system the country had chosen to leave behind. The damage to Constantine's reputation was especially difficult because it rested on ambiguity rather than clarity. Reuters records that he remained deeply unpopular because he had sworn in the military junta before later trying to resist it. That sequence never allowed for an easy public verdict. To sympathizers, he was a young monarch caught in an impossible constitutional trap, trying first to contain disaster and then to reverse it. To critics, he had already lost the argument the moment he lent legitimacy to the colonels. That split mattered because once a public figure becomes associated with compromise at the point of crisis, every later explanation sounds weaker than the original wound. Anne-Marie, by contrast, often appeared less as the architect of the story than as one of its quietest casualties. The very young queen whose public role had been overtaken by events she could not control. There were consequences beyond symbolism. Reuters notes that Constantine and Anne-Marie lived for years in London before returning to Greece later in life. That kind of exile changes the texture of a royal story. It removes the daily theatre of monarchy while preserving its memory, which can be a harsher fate than a clean ending. They were still royal by lineage, still linked to Europe's dynastic network, still recognizable in photographs beside other monarchs and former monarchs. But the central stage had gone. Their marriage continued, their family expanded, and their status remained visible internationally, yet the political world that had once given their union its meaning no longer belonged to them. They were living proof that image can survive even after power does not. And that is where the public narrative became especially revealing. The story of Anne-Marie and Constantine was never consumed only as history. It was consumed as royal spectacle, as cautionary tale, and as unresolved argument. Some people saw them as dignified exiles who had carried themselves with restraint through humiliation and loss. Others saw in Constantine the last representative of a compromised institution. a man whose misjudgments had helped discredit the crown at the moment it most needed moral clarity. Reuters captured that tension in the image of his funeral in Athens in January 2023. Born a prince, buried a commoner, mourned by European royalty, but in a country that had long since voted to end the monarchy. That single contrast says almost everything about the afterlife of the scandal. The symbolism survived, the sovereignty did not. What this story reveals, ultimately, is how ruthless the relationship between monarchy and public perception can be. Royal image-making depends on continuity, confidence, and the suggestion that ceremony reflects something solid underneath. But once the public suspects that the image is thinner than it looks, every photograph changes meaning. Anne-Marie and Constantine did not become famous for a private betrayal or a tabloid implosion. They became something rarer and, in some ways, sadder. A couple whose marriage was permanently shadowed by the collapse of the world around it. The aftermath was not loud, it was long. And that is often the more haunting form of damage. In the end, what was left behind was not only the memory of a lost throne, it was the outline of a marriage that had outlived the world that first gave it meaning. Constantine died in January 2023, more than half a century after he and Anne-Marie were forced into exile in late 1967. By then, the argument over monarchy in Greece had long been settled, and even the Greek Prime Minister described his death as the formal epilogue of a chapter closed by the referendum of 1974. That is what gives this story its aftertaste. The drama did not end when they fled. It ended slowly, over decades, until history itself seemed to move on and leave the couple standing inside a memory that no longer had political power behind it. And yet the image never disappeared completely. Anne-Marie remained the surviving witness to that vanished world. The young Danish princess who had once become queen, then exile, then the keeper of a family story shaped by ceremony, displacement, and endurance. Even after Constantine's death, the family's tie to Greece was still visible. In September 2024, their daughter Theodora married in Athens, and the Greek royal family said the decision reflected the family's love for Greece and the strong ties they still maintained with the country. That detail matters because it shows that what was lost was not attachment, but legitimacy. The emotional bond to Greece survived. The crown did not. That may be the truest way to understand Anne-Marie and Constantine. This was not a story about a glamorous marriage collapsing into tabloid ruin. It was a story about a royal couple who remained together, while the meaning of their public life was stripped away piece by piece. What they lost was larger than status and harder to replace than privilege. They lost the future their marriage had been built to represent. They lost the illusion that youth, grace, and dynastic symbolism could protect anyone from the violence of politics. And in the end, what remained was something quieter. A marriage remembered less as a triumph than as a vessel that carried love, duty, and history through a long and permanent aftershock. Perhaps that is why their story still lingers, not because the public ever fully understood it, but because it carried one of monarchy's oldest contradictions in its purest form. The photographs promised permanence. The reality delivered exile. The titles suggested continuity. The lived experience was interruption, removal, and a lifetime spent after the fall. Behind the polished surfaces, behind the wedding grandeur and the royal lineage, what remained was a couple who had once seemed to embody the future and ended up preserving the memory of something already gone. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more royal and celebrity documentaries, share your thoughts in the comments, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next chapter.